So here's the Thomistic moral argument. So the Thomistic moral argument that I've been working on goes like this. Premise 1, moral realism is true. Premise 2, if moral realism is true, then God exists. Premise 3, therefore God exists. Premise 4, if God exists, then moral realism is true. Premise 5, therefore moral realism is true. Premise 6, therefore moral realism is true if and only if God exists. So let me try and just explain the mechanics of the argument, because it might seem a little redundant, for instance, because someone could say, well, why didn't you just say, if God exists, then moral realism is true, or what is it? Yeah, if moral realism is true, why didn't you just stop it at the first three premises of the argument? And the reason why is because I think the fourth premise is also important for the Euthyphro dilemma, because one of the most natural objections is, well, no, moral realism can't lead to God's existence because God's existence is somehow going to undermine our very concept of moral realism or goodness with triviality and so forth. And we'll get to that eventually. So that's why I included the fourth premise. And then the sixth is just kind of a biconditional to give the argument extra bite, and to make it more controversial, just to see how other people will react. Let me see here. So let me unpack then kind of how some of the premises work. So if God exists, then moral realism is true. So usually speaking, when people like William Lane Craig or other theists explain the moral argument, they usually operate on some version of divine command theory. I don't like strong divine command theory, but I do like if it's supplemented with natural law theory, and that's going to be an interesting discussion for the next few issues. But here's how the argument basically works. So the argument goes like this. We have four principles or four ideas or theses from the Thomistic philosophy, that is the philosophy developed by St. Thomas Aquinas. And my argument here is that these four theses can not only lead to the existence of God, but they also lead to an ethical theory in its own right. So the principle of sufficient reason, to quote it from Alexander Proust, everything that is the case must have a reason why it is the case. Necessarily every true, or at least every contingent true proposition has an explanation. Every event has a cause. So Proust summarizes it on the back of the book, actually, as every contingent fact has an explanation. Real essentialism is the idea that the metaphysical position that everything is the world, that everything in the world has an essence or nature that fixes its identity, and essence of a thing is its nature, that whereby it is what it is what we grasp intellectually when we identify things' genus and specific difference. Things have a real definition of what they are. The convertibility principle states goodness is the same as being itself, but considered from a particular point of view, that of fulfillment of appetite. That's from David Otterberg's book, The Metaphysics of Good and Evil. So in other words, goodness is the actualization of potential, a kind of fullness. And there are different, there are various arguments they can give for each of these. And I'll do that after I present all the definitions. So the principle of finality states, every nature is ordered to an end. That nature does not act in vain, that the end is the first principal activity, and that the end is the reason for all movement. And in short, if A is by nature an efficient cause of B, then generating B must be the final cause of A. So just to go down each of these real quick to offer an argument. Different arguments have been offered for the principle of sufficient reason. One of them is just self-evidence. It just seems to make sense that everything that is contingent or could have been otherwise has an explanation for why it's one way rather than the other. And some people would claim that all of science itself basically depends upon the PSR. Real essentialism is the idea that in the world we observe multiplicity and unity, right? So we observe that there are multiple things in the world, and that this multiplicity also has bits of unity in it. So for instance, I can tell that I am not identical to the tree that's outside my window. And I can tell that Ben is not identical to, let's say, the sun in the sky. There is something actually different between these two substances in question. And it's not just a conceptual difference, but it's something real or proper to each of these things in question. And the argument is that in real essentialism, David Otterberg's book, identifying an essence is kind of a logical precursor to doing anything else. It's the thing that we have to grasp in order to be able to identify multiplicity and unity in the world. And I think Otterberg says something like metaphysics is prior to epistemology, right? Because epistemology is thinking about something. Well, if you're going to be thinking about things, then you had better know what that thing is and what individuates it from other things in question. So that's the idea of real essentialism. The convertibility principle, I mean, one argument you can give is a really simple semantic argument. And I did this last time with Ben. So for instance, Otterberg uses this in his paper, Being and Goodness. So, he says, imagine that you're walking down the road with your son, or you're hiking with your son, and you see on a tree a particular triangle. And you tell your son, that's a pretty good triangle. And then you start asking yourself, that's kind of a weird thing. One, I noticed that it was a triangle, and I said it was pretty good. So you're measuring an instantiation or an actual example of a triangle based on how closely it matches its essence. And then the thing is, once it's more fully as it is supposed to be, then it's more good. It's kind of, if you will, the drawing of a triangle is aiming towards what an actual triangle is supposed to be, with all of its features and so forth. So there's already kind of a teleological structure of aiming towards completion. And then the principal finality, sometimes teleology is taken to be like extrinsic teleology. So for instance, like an intelligent design, or even in young earth creationism, right? Like the idea is that God imposes order onto the world and the world itself doesn't contain that order. The principal finality actually says, no. In the world itself, you have a teleological structure where things are acting in accordance to their nature. So when a cause produces some effect, it's because the cause is supposed to produce that effect in question. So it's not just the case that you have efficient causes where X leads to Y, but also that X is supposed to lead to Y in some sense. There's kind of a relationship between the efficient cause and the final cause, and together they make sense of each other. So for instance, natural law theorists would not be Humeans. We wouldn't say that it's just a regularity that we're observing in nature, but things are doing just what they do by nature. That's the argument there. So how does this lead to God? Well, okay, so I'm not going to go over the full arguments for the existence of God because that would take way too long. So let me try to summarize each of these. So St. Thomas Aquinas had 6 famous ways of proving the existence of God, and I'm just going to cover 3 of them very quickly. So the De Ante argument says the following. There is a real distinction between essence and existence. So for instance, Fazer uses an argument to defend this premise in 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. And the idea is that, when we offer a real definition of something, we're giving it a semantic kind of treatment. So for instance, let's say, you have a unicorn, you have, I think it was a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and you have, let's say, a giraffe. If you ask the kid to describe just based on the descriptions of each of the animals alone, so if you offered a real description of each of these animals, could the kid actually figure out which one currently exists, once existed, or never existed at all? Well, Fazer would argue no, because you can give each of these creatures meaningful, real definitions or semantical treatments of them. So it seems to be the case that the essence of a creature itself does not secure its existence. Because I can offer a real definition, a full description of what a being is, that doesn't mean that it has to be in existence. So then Aquinas argues that there has to be an explanation for why beings with essences, who exist, but don't have essences that necessitate their existence, why they exist in the first place. And Aquinas says in order to break this causal regress, you're going to have to get to a being whose essence is existence, whose very nature is simply just to exist. So that's the De Ante argument. And if you run it with a convertibility principle, then you can get a being who's actually essentially perfect, because existence or a fulfillment of sorts, being and goodness, are convertible. So then this being would be essentially good. The first way is just the Aristotelian proof. So the idea is that the world is divided in act and potency, and change is the actualization of an object's potential by an already actual actualizer. And the idea is that in order to break an infinite causal regress again, you need a being who is by nature just pure act. And the reason why you can have a being that's pure act, but not pure potentiality at least, is because potentiality is parasitic upon actuality. Actuality is the more fundamental of the two, even though the two both constitute reality as a whole. So that's the first way. We got to get a purely active or being a pure act. And then the 5th way is just a teleological argument. And the reason why I put it in here was just to get us to an argument that there has to be a being with a intellect in question. So it's not just perfectly good, but also has an intellect of sorts. So the fifth way looks at the world like this. We see that things in the world act towards certain ends. And it seems as if things in the world have, even organic and inorganic substances have this intentionality built into them, where they are striving towards certain ends rather than others. And Aquinas argues that the only thing that can actually direct, let's say, an inorganic, a thing without a mind, towards its end is a mind itself. So he uses the example like when you shoot an arrow. The arrow on its own cannot shoot itself towards its proper end, but with the guidance of an intellect, it can do the thing in question. So Aquinas is basically saying the world contains intentionality or teleology in it. And the source of this intentionality is probably a mind, since minds have this feature of intentionality built into them already and can move and act upon other material substances. So let's see here. I mean, and even in like the philosophy of mind, intentionality is now considered a part of consciousness, which is a pretty interesting thing to think about. So the natural law theory is the basic idea that there is no fact-value distinction in nature, that nature is moving towards certain purposes, and different beings have different purposes. There's a human good, there's an animal good, there's a good for, let's say, a plant, there's a good for, let's say, other creatures that exist and prowl about the earth. And the idea is that natural law theory is a study of how to fulfill your nature. So just to briefly run down the argument, first we can begin the PSR. Human action has an intelligible structure to it, where human beings act for intelligible reasons. And Aristotle in the beginning of Politics says that every agent that acts for what he takes to be good. So human beings act on the basis of what they take to be good and worthwhile. There's an intelligible structure to the action itself. And this means then that human action itself is inescapably connected or motivated by the good. When we get into the second thesis about real essentialism, we would say that human beings, by their natures and their faculties, have certain goal-directed ends that they're trying to accomplish, and this is just by virtue of being human. And the goal then of human beings, when we instantiate ourselves or act in certain ways, is to be fully human in the fullest sense possible, so that we can achieve the highest rank of the human good. And that's how we get the convertibility principle, where as human beings become more fulfilled, as we have these appetites towards, let's say, friendship, towards community, we have appetites towards beauty. The natural law theorists would consider this to be part of the human good itself. Ben and I right now have an appetite towards knowledge, right? That's just something that is essential or key to being human itself. And as we pursue this, we are pursuing the human good. And then the principle of finality simply states that when we do this particular end, we're not acting in vain. We're acting for something that is within the structure of reality itself, the very purpose of what we're aiming towards. So then there is no fact-value distinction. Science, or ethics rather, just becomes a science of how to fulfill our natures. And then, of course, there's like different principles you can develop, like the doctrine of double effect. You can develop the fundamental principle of natural law morality is to do good and avoid evil. And evil is considered a privation or a lack of what should be there, of what should be fulfilled. And the should there is grounded in teleology. All right, so the slide here, moral realism is true only if God exists. This is probably the more controversial premise of the whole argument, and it's going to be a fun one to discuss. So I have this argument, or this intuition, if you will, that moral realism must be comprehensively intelligible because it necessarily depends upon a compelling account of causality and ontology. So throughout Ben's presentation, Ben tries to avoid making really strong ontological claims. He's not trying to make any significant ontological commitments about causality. He's just saying, look, here are the reasons that we have, and we have this like feature of counting in favor of, just built into the way in which we think about things already. So we don't have to really like take into consideration the causal order and all the other stuff that Swan is interested in. And I'd say actually, no, you do. It's almost inescapable. So here's why. So first, if we're going to argue from like we have reliable faculties, then we're going to need some sense of cognitive normativity in order to be able to say, all right, so when exactly do we know that someone's faculty of reasoning is functioning properly? And here, this is going to depend upon some type of idea of norm, like, well, your faculty should be producing this belief, right? And then there has to be an explanation for where this normative feature comes from. So I think I would make the argument that maybe Ben takes this for granted, especially when we look at then the second point on causal reliability. So I made the point that, whenever we think about something, we're thinking about something in the world itself, usually speaking. Sometimes we're thinking about abstract concepts as well. But there has to be a reliable connection between the information that's in the world and then the information that's being processed within our intellects. It can't be the case that, maybe that thing, I'm seeing things as they are, or maybe, the informational content is just unreliably being given to me. Maybe I have right opinion, but I don't ever have knowledge truly. So a Gettier problem, right? These are things that you want to avoid. You want to ensure that you have a reliable cognitive faculty that also has a reliable causal connection to the world and the informational content that's there. The other thing too is just like the semantical plausibility of ethical naturalism and functionalism. So if you look into the work of Philippa Foot, especially, I think she makes this point quite well, that even though most people, at least during her time, and I think even now maybe the case holds true, rejected or accepted the fact-value distinction, Philippa Foot made the argument that actually no, there's something significant about nature's role in making sense of what's good. So for instance, like when we use this concept of harm, we're implying that there's a way that things should be. When I say that, oh, I have a bad hand or my heart's not doing well, I'm implying this normativity that's built within nature itself. And Philippa Foot would make the argument that you basically need these basic concepts of how things should function, how things should be, in order for when you process them in your intellect and make these moral judgments, that there's actual content, if you will, for it to process. So for instance, when I'm processing that Ben shouldn't harm me, right? It's not a purely intellectual thing that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the reality of, let's say, the way that my body should be functioning, right? So the two are connected together. That's the basic point I'm making. And then when you look at, David Otterberg's argument and other convertibility principle arguments, it just seems as if it's so natural for us to speak in this way. So then the point would be, well, look, if this is there, this natural kind of way in which we talk about things, and we want to ensure that, let's say, this is another point on the other slide, or on the other 10 principles or standards for judging moral arguments. Like, we want to ensure that we have a reliable way of speaking about the world and connecting these ideas, the information, into thoughts and so forth. So it seems as if this is a very natural thing for us to do. And it's going to be kind of difficult if you just say, well, no, there's no connection between the two at all. It's just something that we naturally develop, if you will. And then the last thing is the oneness of reality. And this is a point that I think Ben really liked a lot. So the oneness of reality is this idea that, look, if we're going to offer a moral theory, right, and we're going to offer in this account of moral realism, and we recognize that moral realism depends upon us also having reliable cognitive faculties, having a reliable connection between the outside world and the information content, if you will, entering our intellects. And we see that it's just so natural for us to speak, and it seems almost essential for us to speak of normativity in nature in order to even do the enterprise of ethics intelligibly. Then whatever explanation we offer for our thesis of moral realism, it has to include all of that in. The explanans has to include this set of explanandum, to put it a little bit more fancy. So then, to put a sub-argument here, I would make the argument that non-theistic accounts of morality, one, they lack comprehensiveness in the sense that I've described, with explaining all of this under one unified umbrella. And then second, if you don't have comprehensiveness, then your view kind of goes out the window. It's not explaining something that really needs to be there in order for you to have an intelligible account of moral realism. That's the contention there. So then we can make the point stronger if we can also cite 10 different standards by which we can measure these arguments. So for instance, one is just intuitive fit, and I think like Ben and I both have that. The second is empirical adequacy, right? And then all of this is really coming from Rob Koons's work, but how should I put it? Rob Koons recognizes that other theorists in other different areas with different convictions are also realizing that there is a connection between causation, teleology, the mind, values, and norms, and so forth. So this isn't just Rob Koons over in the corner just writing this book, right? And this is an idea that he's thinking about. Even, in fact, a lot of these metaphysical standards that he's setting forward are found in other parts of the literature. But anyway, so there's empirical adequacy, there's semantical reliability, epistemic access, metaphysical fecundity, unification, simplicity, normativity, applicability, and competitiveness. So 8 and 9 are more specific to morality itself. So it's just saying a proper moral theory should have an explanation for how it grounds ought statements and why departure from a norm is bad or something one ought not to do. Applicability just means that we can take the moral theory and actually apply it to our everyday problems. So it's not going to be the case that I have this account of goodness and then it literally doesn't help us make any progress on figuring out what's right and wrong. And then the rest kind of flows in if you recognize that, you know, you can't escape these ontological commitments, or at least touching on causality in metaphysics. So the argument that I would just make here is that natural law theory is built upon the Aristotelian Thomist synthesis, and you can actually construct a very compelling account of mind, a very compelling account of causation. So, like, for instance, cognitive normativity, insert the principle of finality, combine it with real essentialism. It was within human nature to have this faculty of reason, and the whole point of the faculty of reason is to be aimed at truth, because that's part of the human good. That's what's fulfilling for our faculties. And that's the norm, if you will, that's built into nature. Causal reliability. So basically, because all of reality has this unification to it, and all of reality is intelligible, and it has this normativity built into it, we can trust, generally speaking, the information that's coming to us, because nature and the causal order has a norm, a way that it ought to function or usually does function. And then for me, the semantical plausibility of ethical naturalism and functionalism, yeah, you know, let's bring it, you know, and then incorporate into my view. It's very natural. It fits in quite nicely. We're recognizing just something intrinsic to the world itself. And then when you combine this with the oneness of reality, natural law theory and the metaphysical principles that it's built upon can have empirical adequacy. So Rob Koons, Alexander Pruss, I think Bruce Simpson in the book Neo-Aristotelian Perspectives on Contemporary Science, they make this argument that the same metaphysical principles that natural law theory is built on can also be applied into science, into quantum mechanics, and actually make sense of a lot of those areas. So just to make the point short and sweet, this is a metaphysical theory of everything, and it takes the oneness of reality very seriously. And it says that, look, because moral realism is part of the reality of the world, and moral realism is connected to the causal reality of the world, and the causal reality of the world is connected to all sorts of various other things like the fundamental ontology of the world. Natural law theory is built upon this metaphysical hypothesis or theory that can explain all of this under one very beautiful, neat umbrella. So hence simplicity, unification, you have metaphysical fecundity, and then epistemic access, that's there as well, and so on and so forth. You have the whole package. And that's the argument I'd make, that my account is comprehensive, Ben's account isn't.